Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm a fellow and director of academic affairs at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Today's program is to help launch the 32nd volume of our joint U.S.-Korea Academic Studies annual publication, the papers from which you can find on our website, which are up as of last night. You can find them under the analysis and then publications tab on our website, keia.org. In the book, there are 15 chapters spread across 3 sections. For today's program, we've distilled all this around one of the central themes running throughout the book, which is the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on great power competition. We can't fit nearly everything in the book into a 1-hour session. So this is just this hour program is just to get you sort of an appetizer into the rest of the book. We really hope it encourages you to read the rest of the chapters and the sections that we aren't going to necessarily get as in-depth into here today. But don't worry, we'll be covering the book in its entirety, at least briefly. Colleague Gil Rosman will be providing brief overviews of each of the book's 3 sections, while the other speakers here today will talk about their papers in the book. And please feel free to ask questions at any point throughout the session. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover here, so I'm just going to get right into the introductions. First up, we'll have Gil Rosman. Gil is the Emeritus Musgrave Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. He's also the Editor-in-Chief of the Asan Forum. And most importantly, for our purposes here today, he is the Editor-in-Chief of the Joint U.S.-Korea Academic Studies publication, where he has served in that position for about a decade now. And I've been working with Gil on the book for the past 6 years now, and it's been a real pleasure. And we're really looking forward to working with him on the 33rd volume next year as well. Presenting his paper from the first section is Jacques de Lille. He is the Stephen A. Kozer Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and co-director of the Center for Asian Law at the University of Pennsylvania as well. And he also serves as the director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Next up, presenting her paper from the second section is Danielle Cohen. She is a lecturer in politics and history at Lake Forest College. Her research interests include the politics of East Asia, demography policy, and Chinese foreign policy. She's a frequent contributor to the Asan Forum, which Gil serves as editor-in-chief for, and she oversees the country report for China there. And then finally, covering the third section, we have my colleague at KEI, Troy Stangarone. He's a senior director and fellow here at KEI. He oversees KEI's trade and economic related initiatives, as well as one of our other publications, Korea's Economy. And he also oversees our blog, The Peninsula, and he is a regular contributor to The Diplomat and the Korea Times. So with that, I'll turn things over now to Gil to get us started on the book.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you for your invaluable contributions throughout the process to get this book across. We do this in a 1-year process, so we ask people to join us and then go from there to get panel presentations, and then finally to get a volume. And it takes place in a very efficient, quick process, and Kyle has a lot to do with that. I also want to thank KEI for the vision it has accepted for how we should proceed here. Very strong academic depth, cohesive coverage of 3 themes, an overview of the transformation of the Indo-Pacific region in a single year, each year covering what happened during that process, with 3 overarching themes. And this year we have an overarching single theme as well, and that is the impact of the pandemic. So I'll get right into the panel number 1, the first section of the book, and that is, was the pandemic a geopolitical game changer in the Indo-Pacific? And there are really multiple options. Not much changed. It was really predictable what happened. A lot changed, but the pandemic wasn't very important. A lot changed, but Biden would reverse it. And finally, the pandemic caused the changes and things were irreversible. I think we come down overwhelmingly on the side of the pandemic was essentially a catalyst, accelerating a phenomena that were already underway, but not really altering them in any substantial manner. And the Sino-US deterioration of relationships was already ongoing. We saw this from the wolf warrior approach of the Chinese and the US resolve to stand in the way of a Sino-centric aggressiveness. So really the option that we end up with is it was the catalyst, the pandemic accelerated things, and that they are not reversible in any fashion we can imagine. Now, among the chapters, I won't, of course, talk about Jacques, but I'll mention the first chapter we cover is Yun Sun as coverage of Chinese thinking about the pandemic. And she's really terrific in analyzing what Chinese are debating. She talks about the Chinese strategic community seeing this as a watershed event. It reshaped the structure of the international system, even making parallels to the end of World War II, as if this was comparable in its significance. The tide in the world turned in China's favor. And even though Biden is somewhat different from Trump, he stabilizes things more, really, he's expanding anti-Chinese multilateralism, and there's no fundamental change taking place. So that's a chapter I really heartily recommend. Then we have a chapter from Joseph Liao, and he focuses on Southeast Asia. He saw in those countries, they saw this as an opportunity for China to deepen its engagement, taking advantage of the pandemic, but bifurcation was intensifying. The region was skeptical of China's intentions. They were concerned about over-reliance. Their thinking was primarily about the economic considerations, but they didn't want to compromise their autonomy. And the COVID-19 drove home the stark reality of a need to balance their growing disquiet with Chinese assertiveness and their need to maintain, if not deepen, some of the economic and even political ties with China. It's a really balanced overall presentation. The next chapter is by Woo Jong-hyuk on South Korea, and he sees worsening Sino-US ties reverberating and putting more pressure on Korea from one or both countries. It's trying to maintain some kind of balance, but the pressure from China was mounting even earlier. Public opinion was turning more critical of China. China's position towards South Korea emphasized more warnings, possible retaliation if red lines were crossed. And now he points to discussion in US policy circles about the challenge for Seoul. Never has Korea faced such a dilemma between the push and pull coming from Beijing and Washington. And the final chapter here is Glenn Fukushima's coverage focusing on Japan. So how did Japan think about the pandemic? And he emphasizes Japan has tried to steer a path, accepting the growing economic influence of China in the region while maintaining close political and security ties with the US and strengthening ties to Southeast Asia. If this pandemic accelerated Japan's drive to diversify and to walk a fine line. The fact that Trump was so negative about China was mostly a plus for Japan. And there was some uncertainty that Biden would maintain that course, but there have been plenty of reassurances that that's the case. But at the same time, Japanese are somewhat nervous that things could go too far in the direction of pressure. Well, those are the comments I had on part one. And now, just to start off before just let me turn to Jacques to give his very important chapter on the US thinking particularly about China.
Well, thank you, Gil, and thanks to everyone at KEI and all of my colleagues in this project. It's great to be here this morning, and I really do recommend the book to everyone listening and beyond. So as Gil says, this part of the book and my chapter as well are about the question of whether the COVID pandemic has been a geopolitical game changer, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And if it is a geopolitical game changer, it's going to show up in U.S.-China relations in and with the region. My chapter, again, focuses mostly on the U.S. side. I really do recommend Sun Yun's chapter on Chinese thinking, which takes the view that it is, as Gil said, a geopolitical game changer. I don't think it is. I think the answer from the U.S. perspective, at least, is that for geopolitics in Asia, at least in terms of the significant challenges and opportunities for the U.S., what we see after COVID is pretty much like what we saw before COVID, only more so. That is to say, the impact of the pandemic reflects and amplifies a bunch of trends that were already there rather than affecting a fundamental transformation in geopolitics in the region. So the impact is, of course, global, but it is especially pronounced in the Indo-Pacific and within the Indo-Pacific, especially in East Asia. In the wake of the pandemic, well, that's probably optimistic, at this phase in the pandemic and whatever comes after it, I think what we're likely to see is what we've seen in the most recent months, which is the U.S. has some opportunities to recover and to limit the adverse impacts on U.S. influence and power in the region. And some of these opportunities are rooted in missteps by China in its handling of the COVID pandemic, and others are partly the fruit of relatively well-chosen U.S. policies. You can see this across a familiar set of factors that matter for geopolitics, and they're captured in a lot of international relations theory. I won't drag this audience through all of that, except for the cognoscenti, you'll see the occasional trace of IR theory here and there. To start out, I mean, COVID clearly was a big setback for the United States in its engagement with the region. It was a terrible thing for the U.S. model at home, what had been a global paradigm or paragon of public health policy didn't seem to work so well. The U.S. did not handle the pandemic at all well, especially under Trump. And the stories of U.S. failure were amplified by Chinese sources, which stressed how badly the U.S. was doing. And done better recently, of course, although, again, all things are fragile. The U.S. approach to COVID also failed externally. That is, not only was the U.S. model, which was already dinged in a variety of ways, tarnished further by the mishandling of COVID, but the U.S. response to the crisis internationally, the travel bans, the blaming of China, and the sort of go-it-alone nationalist, vaccine nationalism kind of policy, further diminished U.S. stature. And so if you then take a look at how this occurred, it all unfolded in what was already a problematic context for the U.S. and the geopolitics of the region. So we'd seen the U.S. retreat from international institutions. You all know the story. Under Trump, amid COVID, the U.S. opted out of the WHO, and that came in the context of a broader turn against international institutions and regimes. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the UN Human Rights Commission, the Paris Accords, you name it, the U.S. was turning away from international institutions. That was a Trump phenomenon, again amplified by COVID, but it had much deeper roots. The TPP, of course, was in trouble well before the Trump administration came to power. The U.S. had dragged its feet on a number of major international conventions for years, Law of the Sea, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant, and things like that. And more broadly, you'd seen the U.S. in recent decades start to think that this rules-based international order, which we're all talking about again, was not serving U.S. interests quite so well. And that's, typical, right? The hegemon that sets up the post-war order suddenly is paying a lot of the costs and not getting all of the benefits. Long-term erosion. Secondly, you can look at the ideational conflict that emerged between the U.S. and China. Here, of course, the China virus, the Wuhan flu, all of the Kung flu, all of the racist terms coming out of the Trump administration did not do great things. But they were not just about insulting and taking on China over the COVID pandemic. It was also part of a much broader demonization or attack on China during the period, the trade wars, the tech wars, the language we saw in the national security strategy about whole of government and whole of society conflicts, lumping China with Russia as an adversary and so on. But here too, the roots are long pre-COVID and pre-Trump. Constructive engagement was already pretty much dead, or at least at best on a ventilator somewhere in an ICU. Too soon for a COVID joke. All right, well, the general trend here had been emerging for quite some time. we'd certainly seen the U.S. take a much dimmer view of China, and the notion that you only have to go back really to the 90s to think about, which was engaging China was going to do the constructivist trick of turning China into a much more benevolent actor on the world stage in the U.S. view, and perhaps even transform it domestically. That idea had gone out the window. We were headed toward things which we now hear about as perhaps heralding a new Cold War. If you look at things like the relative shift in power, the thing that's always at the core of geopolitics discussions, in the region and more generally, COVID accelerated again something that had been going on. So the U.S. Retreat from global leadership generally was amplified by the way the U.S. handled the COVID crisis, particularly the contrast to China, which China was happy to point out. And even at the worst moments of COVID, it looked like the U.S. military might be compromised. We had some COVID outbreaks on ships, some maneuvers and drills canceled and so on. But there was a general sense that COVID had led the U.S. to become more preoccupied with its internal problems, even more than it had been before. And here again, it's not just COVID. We'd seen the longer-term Trump era dissing of many of the relationships with allies. There were some exceptions here, the free and open Indo-Pacific, and of course, as Gil noted, a pretty good relationship with Japan. But in general, there was a sense that the U.S. was in some retreat, and we'd been worried about the retreat for some time, trying to redress the decline in relative power. So you look at things like the pivot or rebalance, the emphasis in U.S. defense planning on China scenarios, the South China Sea, and so on. And of course, this all unfolded in the still broader context of power transition theory, right? The general rise of China relative to the US and what that would mean. These patterns and trends that are in part of geopolitics and affect geopolitics, these are especially pointed in the Indo-Pacific and within the Indo-Pacific, especially in East Asia. The regional international organization infrastructure is especially thin in that region, and China's presence in organizations is relatively robust, the ASEAN Plus arrangements, the RCEP, and so on. Ideational rivalry between the US and China, well, the Indo-Pacific states are at the front line of that ideological fracture. And if you look at the economic agenda, economic decoupling, which is built into this as well, you can see that there were some opportunities, of course, for regional states, but by and large, Indo-Pacific states, and particularly East Asian states, threatened to get hit most severely by disruptions of the global supply chain and attempts to pursue U.S.-China decoupling. In terms of relative power decline, obviously that's most significant in the Indo-Pacific and in areas adjacent to China. China has locational advantages and has its core interests built in. So that all was a case where COVID, again, accelerated a lot of pre-existing trends in power and institutions and ideology and in economics. But I think all of it adds up to kind of a quantitative rather than a qualitative change. And now we've recently seen the U.S. begin to push back to try to remedy some of those shifts that have gone in China's favor and against the U.S. Some of those opportunities are rooted in China's kind of having botched it. China didn't handle COVID well at the beginning. It did better afterwards, tried to sell its model, engaged in some COVID diplomacy, mask diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, and so on. But it was hard to escape the fact that the domestic model there was somewhat unappealing, quite draconian, and a sense that China's aid sometimes had strings attached, sometimes wasn't so good in terms of quality, and sometimes was used to political ends. Think of the attempt to get Paraguay, for instance, to switch recognition or diplomatic relations from Taipei to Beijing in return for some Sinovacs. The other part of the story is that on the U.S. side, the Biden administration has undertaken what I would call a restorationist agenda across all of those areas. So you see things like the general improvement in the U.S. performance at home on COVID, although still fragile, and U.S. re-engagement in providing assistance and cooperation internationally. That sort of helps burnish the image. But if you go down the checklist that I had, you see attempts to redress. So in terms of ideational conflict, you see a less confrontational, less vituperative, although still pretty tough line, extremely tough line on China. On economic decoupling, again, you see the end, perhaps, of the full-fledged trade war, but you've seen Trump tariffs kept in place, you've seen lots of criticism of Chinese behavior, and you've seen a Build Back Better and supply chain security strategy that are still not exactly a full reversal of decoupling. If you look at relative power shifts, there's been a lot of talk of rebuilding alliances, of course, the Quad and the Alliance of Democracies, and so on. And in international institutions, the U.S. has at least re-engaged, but you've still heard a lot of criticism of the WHO. So if you're looking at this from the Indo-Pacific perspective, okay, it's some recovery, some clawing back, but it's not profoundly transformative. I want to close, since I know I'm out of my time here, on one area where I think we may be seeing an incipient change. And that is what the COVID fallout in the Indo-Pacific has shown are two things about the limits of great power approaches to this. The US and China did not do a great job, especially compared to, say, Taiwan, Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand. Those are countries in the region that have a better model, or so it appears, always hard to judge, but so it appears, at least one that did a bit better than the great powers did in the first round. And secondly, what COVID has underscored is many of the real international relations crises of our era are not ones that great powers are well suited to handle or even to lead the handling of. You need multilateral cooperation. Think of the petition from 20-some countries urging for a new sort of WO enhancing treaty to provide for transparency and greater cooperation. The US and China weren't part of that. A couple of regional states were. But if you do have a world where the problems are of this nature, and the US and China don't seem to be able to handle it either at all or as preeminent leaders in the response, we may need to rethink how we deal with things that have the kind of impact that geopolitics has us worried about. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacques. Section 2 of the book deals with bilateral national identity gaps. Section 1 was a single country's thinking, how it was evolving during the year. Section 2 is really how countries think about each other. And an identity gap is what they think is the difference and the impact of the other country's national identity on their own. So we open this section with the Sino-US gap. Danielle will be presenting that. And then the second paper here was my own on the Russian-US gap. That also widened considerably over the course of this year, although we might think there's some tempering effect of the Biden-Putin summit last month. Basically, Russia responded to the change from Trump to Biden with a very harsh argument about the US being immersed in Cold War thinking and treating Russia as an enemy. And there is no country that has emphasized the fact we're in a Cold War more than Russia. And finally, the US was reciprocating. There was a kind of echo. What was wrong with Russia? We began to see Russia more in terms of its socialist past instead of its reform transformation beginning in the 90s. So Russia demonized the United States more, and the US responded. Now, this paper is about the Indo-Pacific region, and that isn't usually the focus of discussions of Russo-US relations. But in this region, there's more potential for cooperation because we don't have the legacy of the Soviet Union and the lost republics the way we have in so many other areas, or the conflicts affecting Russia in Europe. But the sharp national identity gap widened, and much of it is related to the fact that Russia has tried to pretend it has no identity gap with China, unlike the decades of Sino-Soviet dispute when the gap seemed to be enormous. So this paper analyzes how that thinking in Russia evolved and some of the US responses to it. There was a third paper for this section by Tandi Madan about India-China relations and the identity elements of that relationship. She argues that the combination of the pandemic and the boundary crisis in the Himalayas ensured that competitive and conflictual elements of Indo-Sino relations would be front and center. They reinforced and accelerated concerns already present. A view of China as lack of transparency, an uncertain commitment to the rules-based order, a growing influence in the Indo-Pacific that was worrisome. So it fueled concerns about China, and yet with a special emphasis that India depends on China for much of its economy, foreign trade these days. And the Chinese ambassador reminded Indians of how dependent they are on imports of certain products from China. And he warned that even multinational companies operating in India could be adversely affected. So, and China state media went further, linking what India was doing to possible Chinese retaliation. So this is a discussion of the relationship, not much in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of images of each other, particularly the Indian image of China and how it evolved. Scott Snyder wrote a paper on the political paralysis between Japan and South Korea, which of course had intensified from 2018. It continued to be strong, but the pandemic sort of deepened the identity-based challenges. It provided a pretext, however, for privileging domestic issues at the expense of international relations. So in that sense, it may have sort of tempered some of the immediate focus on each other. And he examined conditions generated by responses to pandemic. He identified missed opportunities. Moon lately has tried to reset the relationship after Biden's victory, but Scott argues that under Suga and Moon, it's very unlikely we're going to see any real change in the prospects, despite US emphasis on trilateralism. And finally, there's an unusual paper from a Chinese academic, Dong Xianrong, who looks at disputes between netizens in China and South Korea, emphasizing their 2020 disputes over the origin of pickled vegetables, pao cai and kimchi, which country really was the origin of this. And it really mattered a great deal. There was a lot of intense discussion of this in both countries. And also there was a Van Fleet Award acceptance speech by the BTS singing group that so offended the Chinese because it talked only about the sacrifices of US soldiers, not of Chinese soldiers. And so there's been a lot of tension over national identity issues rooted in how history is understood. And she emphasizes how security influence interests, including the Korean War and the THAAD deployment, helped intensify these attitudes. And I'll close with one statement she found in a Korean source, and that is, kimchi is Korean, COVID-19 is Chinese. That highlights the kind of intensity of these kinds of exchanges going on between these two countries. We'll move now to part three, the impact on supply chains. But before we do so, Danielle, please finish us up on part two.
Well, let me just start by thanking Gil and the Korea Economic Institute for putting together this wonderful project and for inviting me to be part of it. It's really an honor to be here today with all of you. So as Gil said, my contribution looks at the China-US national identity gap and bilateral relations. And what I argue is that the COVID-19 pandemic has really further complicated what was already a very tense Sino-US relationship. So if we think back to before times, if any of us can remember the before times, before the pandemic, we had a China that saw itself as a responsible world power with the right to play a deciding role in global governance structures. And we had a United States that was split between those who supported the Trump administration's America First policy and those who worried about the global repercussions of an isolationist and nativist policy. The pandemic has really called both countries' national identities into question. While China has to date succeeded in keeping its domestic COVID outbreak relatively small, the damage caused by its initial suppression of medical reports in Wuhan and its limited cooperation with the World Health Organization have called into questions Chinese claims to be a responsible world power on the basis of its pandemic performance. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the Trump administration failed to protect US citizens from catastrophic death tolls and prevented the United States from taking a leading role in resolving this global crisis. In January 2021, the Biden administration took office with a focus on swiftly ending the pandemic while also reasserting the traditional US global leadership role. And now here we sit in the summer of 2021 with the pandemic still raging globally, and the US again facing a serious surge with the arrival of the Delta variant. So this pandemic when combined with China's assessment of US power after the 2008 global financial crisis, and with their assessment of US domestic, social, and political instability that's been evident throughout 2020 and 2021, has really strengthened Chinese perceptions that the United States is a country in decline, and that China is a risen great power that should now play a major role in shaping the global order. So let me just sort of start by briefly kind of defining Chinese national identity. And this will be familiar territory for some. Since coming to power in November 2012, Chinese leader Xi Jinping has emphatically asserted China's role as a responsible great power with the right to play this decisive role in global governance structures. This identity of rejuvenated greatness synthesizes historical legitimacy and inevitability with civilizational and economic superiority, and has been consolidated into what's now called Xi Jinping thought. And it really permeates every element of Chinese foreign policy. Xi Jinping argues that socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new era, and that it can serve as a political economic model for states that, quote, want to speed up their development while preserving their independence, end quote. China's identity as an economic powerhouse has gradually replaced its longstanding identity as the leader among developing states. And again, it's increasingly seeing itself as already risen rather than peacefully rising, and therefore ready to start reaping the rewards. Chinese analysts widely argue that the world is shifting from the unipolar moments of the post-Cold War era to a new era of multipolarity that will be characterized by two superpowers, China and the United States, and then many strong powers. So what is the impact of Chinese national identity on China's perceptions of Sino-US relations? Well, what I argue is that China's growing confidence in its own political economic model and its skepticism of the US model are particularly evident in three main aspects. The first of these is the Chinese analysis of the shift of the relative power between China and the United States in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis. The second is the Chinese assessment of US domestic unrest in light of the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the January 2021 Capitol insurrection. And then the third is its views about the implications of the Chinese and US management of the COVID-19 pandemic for post-pandemic global relations. So let me just briefly take these in order. Many Chinese analysts perceive the global financial crisis as a turning point that reviewed the fundamental failures of US-style capitalism and that demonstrated that the United States is a country in decline. Chinese analysts believe that the financial crisis indicated the fundamental failures of neoliberalism, both as an economic philosophy and as a political philosophy that emphasizes human rights, democracy, and freedom. In their view, while the US neoliberal model has faltered, the Chinese economic model has been clearly more successful at maintaining more rapid and more equitable growth. And so by demonstrating weakness in the US model, Chinese analysts believe that the global financial crisis opened up an opportunity for China to emerge as a new global economic power. And we see evidence of this in subsequent initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. The second element of this is Chinese perceptions of social and political unrest in the United States. So Chinese leaders are increasingly confident that China has developed a demonstrably superior political model to that of the United States, even as Xi has implemented more authoritarian policies. China has long condemned US assertions of universal human rights, arguing that this imposes Western values on a global audience, and insisting that rights to subsistence and development are equally as important as the civil liberties that are often prioritized by Americans. Chinese observers have seized on the social unrest brought to the fore by the summer 2020 Black Lives Matter protests across the United States as an opportunity to point to what they see as hypocrisy in US attempts to hold itself up as a model of human rights. And they've also asserted that the Chinese political model is better able to ensure domestic stability, which has long been the Chinese government's key priority. And they point there both to domestic protests in the US, as well as to the 2020 election turmoil that culminated in the January insurrection. The final piece of this, of course, which overshadows everything, is the pandemic. And the Chinese belief that efforts by China and the United States to manage the pandemic indisputably show the superiority of the Chinese government's model of governance. and the Chinese view that the pandemic has hastened a power shift that was already underway between China and the United States. So China has been far better able to mitigate the spread of COVID within its borders than the United States. And with its domestic outbreak largely under control, China gained at least an early upper hand in the so-called vaccine diplomacy. Chinese analysts contend that Chinese efforts to combat the global pandemic indicate its shared commitment to seek multilateral cooperation to address shared challenges. And other Chinese observers have argued that the disparate COVID-19 experiences of China and the United States indicate, again, that this power shift between China and the United States is really accelerating. In the very brief time I have left, I just wanted to very briefly touch on US national identity and its impact on China relations. Here, I'll just say that US national identity has become an increasingly slippery concept over the past several years, given intense partisan polarization. It's very difficult to even figure out if there's a unitary national identity to discuss. But what we do find is, despite kind of domestic divisions, US national identity as a globally active superpower that promotes human rights does remain a very strong influence on the public's views of China, even if this is perhaps less a feature of general US foreign policy than it once was. We see this very clearly in the Biden administration's foreign policy, which is promoting a more traditional understanding of US national identity. We see this in the Biden administration's actions to build a coalition of democratic allies to advance policies that really center human rights and kind of rule of law globally. So let me just conclude by saying, we have a Biden administration that believes that US foreign policy should reflect its democratic values and this will permeate US foreign policy approach to China. But as the United States adopts this democratic values infused foreign policy towards China, it's going to encounter a China that's increasingly confident in the superiority of its political economic model. And so, although I believe that the declarations of a new Cold War are overblown at present, it seems very clear that the two countries' national identity gap is hardening. Unfortunately, this leads to a good amount of pessimism, I think, about what the future holds for the bilateral relationship. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, we move to our final section, and I will be very brief. We will have Troy speaking afterwards, and he has written the opening, and I think the most detailed and informative chapter that sets the tone for understanding supply chain impact of the pandemic. And really, there's been a big change in supply chain discussions in this short period of time. And much of the discussion is really about what the US has done and intends to do, first under Trump and particularly under Biden now. But we also talk about the concerns here from four areas: South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and India. And we're watching for signs of separation from China, for resistance to decoupling policies being emphasized in the US, to the impact of the pandemic, but also to other factors like labor costs, protectionism, and the technological decoupling that security concerns are presenting. These chapters are particularly interested in talking about semi-computer chips in Taiwan and the pharmaceutical industry in India. And they tend to emphasize the desire for more resilient supply chains, lessening dependence on China, but the difficulty in really reducing that dependence all that much, particularly in the short run. So one chapter is by Sujin Kyo, talking about South Korea. And he thinks about a lot of processes that are affecting supply chains. And he emphasizes the movement towards China plus one. But he also says that with the development of RCEP and other factors, there's still regional supply chains centered on China, and they're not going away very soon, even if US policy moves in a different direction. Maria Solis wrote a fascinating paper about Japan, how it led the supply chain revolution, then was transformed by it. And now we're talking about a second revolution with greater emphasis on redundancy and diversification and bifurcation of production chains. And she says that Japan may have the largest third country impact from the US-China supply chain struggles, and that they may end up with a kind of supply chain bifurcation. One set to serve the US market and another the Chinese market, rather than the lean supply chains that were built in the era of US-China engagement. Finally, well, there are two more. One is Chen Jiji on Taiwan. He talks about China bolstering its own red supply chain, supporting its own industries, and the supply chain relationship between Taiwan and the PRC has changed from a complementary vertical division of upstream to downstream, to a competitive relationship in the same horizontal activities. Much emphasis is placed on they changed the semiconductor industry, TSMC, and how it's strengthening its global roadmap by cooperating very closely with the US now in supply chain goals. And the last paper is by Amatendo Palit, and the pharmaceutical industry is particularly affected by the pandemic. India discovered its critical dependence on China for active ingredients. It's tried to build an initiative to get more regional cooperation for more resilient supply chains. But economic concerns with China have been compounded by geopolitical anxieties. And so recent shifts, however, in India, after trying to push hard for diversification, indicated it has a more pragmatic strategy to China and is going to be hesitant about going too far in its changes. I stop there and turn now to Troy for our wrap-up discussion of the papers.
Well, thank you, Gil, and thank you, Kyle, for having me. I'm glad to be here with all of you today. Jacques, in his opening comments, talked about how decoupling started taking place under the Trump administration, and the Biden administration, through its supply chain review and other policies, hasn't necessarily moved to reverse those policies specifically. And so in my paper, one of the things I do is I talk about how what we're seeing right now often predates the pandemic. The pandemic, in many cases, has really become a vehicle for furthering policies that already existed prior to that. But I also go through and I talk about how supply chain disruptions aren't a new phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for a while. I talk about the steps the Biden administration is taking to deal with the supply chain issues. I look at Congress's role. I won't necessarily talk about that today in the interest of time, but Congress has had a significant role in this process, and it goes back a little bit longer as well. And also, I talk about sort of the real challenges we face in trying to move supply chains. This is something that Japan, I'll mention later on, has tried to do. And there's been some level of success, but it's been perhaps not as much as one would hope. And so, what I'd like to start off with is, as I mentioned, supply chain disruption isn't something new. Over the last decade, the world has seen both natural and man-made supply disruptions. In 2011, we remember the earthquake and the tsunami in Japan. It disrupted supply chains for computers, electronics, and automobiles. That same year, there was flooding in Thailand that also disrupted the supply chains for automobiles and computers. So we've had this issue before. The decision by the United Kingdom to withdraw from the European Union is a form of man-made supply chain disruption, and we're seeing this play out now. Disputes between Great Britain and the EU and the levels of trade that have dropped since Brexit formally went into place. The McKinsey Global Institute has noted that disruptions of 2 months or more now occur on average once every 4.9 years. So this is something that is part of the broader supply chain challenge. It's also part of what we are going to see going forward, be they either through man-made issues, be they US policy towards China, the UK's policy towards the EU, or natural disasters. And this is something that is just part of the system now. So while the pandemic has created disruptions on a larger scale, the real difference this time is the geopolitical competition with China. The Trump administration had raised concerns about supply chains running through China prior to the pandemic. We saw specific steps in the Trump administration to limit Chinese access to US technology, early efforts to identify rare earth minerals necessary for defense, and to develop a way to ensure secure supply chains for those rare earth minerals. And while there were multiple motivations for efforts to discourage US production in China, one of them related to these national security issues. So at the end of the day, the pandemic merely became another avenue for the Trump administration to pursue what was already their objective. And we saw this early in the pandemic with comments from Lighthizer, who did pieces in the New York Times and Foreign Affairs, if I remember correctly, talking about how basically the era of globalization was over. You saw comments similar to this from Peter Navarro and also others in the administration. So really, this is something to where the administration saw an effort to take and pursue policies more rigorously through the cover of the pandemic, rather than really seeing the pandemic as a shift in how they should address supply chains. Now, how did supply chains actually perform during the pandemic? And this is sort of a critical key issue, I think, when we really try to consider what steps the US and other countries need to take to secure supply chains and ensure they're resilient. So there are estimates that up to 78% of US supply chains were disrupted by the pandemic. We all initially saw shortages in areas such as personal protective equipment, being able to find face masks, basic equipment like gloves and other things that hospitals needed to take and deal with patients who came in with COVID, as we saw, floods of people heading into hospitals. There were shortages of food, toilet paper, but outside of maybe some of the PPE issues, things like food and toilet paper were often driven by increased demand. Everyone was going to stores wanting to load up on toilet paper, on food and other things. So, for example, if you look at toilet paper itself, production prior to the pandemic was at 92% of pre-pandemic capacity. By March of last year, producers were operating at 99.9%. So, this wasn't necessarily an issue of there not being supply. It was an issue of increased demand. And also you had issues related to different supply chains. And this is one area where I do think we need to look at further. If you look at supplies for food and certain things like toilet paper, there are different supply chains. One that works to supply restaurants and one that works to supply retail consumers like grocery stores. And the products couldn't necessarily easily be shifted. So there were large issues of the destruction of food, which could have been used because it didn't fit into the packaging and the other types of necessities you need for the retail system. In the case of toilet paper, we saw restaurants and office buildings selling the excess toilet paper they had because you had toilet paper that was available, it just wasn't in the right places. We've seen this more recently in the increase in demand for PCs, tablets, phones, games, and other things that have stressed the semiconductor supply chain. This was also impacted by the US-China trade war, as some US companies, specifically automotive industry, cut contracts with Chinese suppliers due to concerns over the trade war. We've also seen vaccine production shortages as well. But a lot of this has been driven by increased demand. And in the case of semiconductors, this is something where production development requires high levels of capital investment, lead times of 2 to 3 years to build new factories. So this is a question, once again, of the system not having the demand, not necessarily the inability to supply, the capacity. While there have been some issues with supply chains, global trade had begun recovering in the second half of last year and had returned to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this year. So what has the Biden administration done? President Biden ran on the idea of building back better and specifically dealing with the pandemic and restoring relations with allies. There were early indications in the administration that national security and domestic concerns would guide the administration's views on supply chains, and Biden himself, in remarks at DOD early on, announced that the Defense Department would take the lead on a China review and specifically related to technology. The interim national security guidance called for economic recovery, investments in national competitiveness, and securing supply chains. But we often saw the focus on things like working through the Quad rather than more broadly through normal trade channels on these types of issues. On the domestic front, Biden stressed that securing supply chains would create good paying jobs and said this specifically in announcing his executive order on the supply chain review. We've now seen the initial review on 4 critical areas in pharmaceuticals for active ingredients, high capacity lithium batteries, semiconductors, and rare earth minerals. While much of the review focuses on the U.S. role, things such as providing additional government funding, how the government can take and purchase goods to create new markets. When it comes to the international side, while the review notes the U.S. cannot supply everything itself, this is an area where it seems to still be lacking and more development is needed. There's a broader review that's going on that will be concluded at the end of this year, and hopefully some of that international side will be in that. But at this point, it seems to be much more focused on restoring capacity in the United States rather than really how you secure supply chains more broadly with our allies and partners. So just briefly to conclude, what I'd like to say is that there are specific challenges that the administration is going to face in trying to move supply chains. One, China in the last 2 decades has become a central role for supply chains. It has replaced Japan as the hub for global value chains in the Asia Pacific and for information technology specifically. Southeast Asia, which people often look to, lacks the infrastructure to completely serve as an alternative for companies. The trade war, if you look at company data, has been a much bigger motivator than the pandemic. And companies have a strong incentive to maintain supply chains in China, specifically because it's the world's 2nd largest economy. It has world-class infrastructure. And so, we heard comments earlier about the idea of basically China plus one strategy, and that's what we're likely to see. And as I mentioned briefly in my remarks at the beginning, Japan tried to do this on rare earth minerals about a decade ago. It's invested significantly in places like Australia. At the time, when you had the initial dispute between China and Japan over rare earth minerals, China accounted for 95% of the world's production. Today, it still accounts for about 85%, and Japan is still dependent on China for 56%. So while the administration is taking and working to try and resolve these issues, this is going to be a difficult process. It's going to be a long-term process. And even if President Biden has 2 terms, it's probably something that will require U.S. government coordination domestically and with our allies over a much longer period to take and really try to address the issues that have come up, not specifically in how supply chains work, because we've seen them bounce back, but more on the issues that are sensitive for national security, be they rare earth minerals or other supplies such as vaccines and medical equipment during future potential crises. Thank you. With that, I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you to everyone for their great presentations, and Gil for so expertly covering such a broad expanse of topics and papers. I just want to ask a few questions to our speakers. I'm going to ask the same question to Jacques and Danielle because we're all talking a lot about the same topics, but I'm hoping you come at it from different angles. And the simple question really, as we think about the impact of the Biden administration and what the Biden administration seeks to do with China, is it still possible to cooperate in key areas such as climate change? I know Biden himself has said there's going to be extreme competition with China. Kirk Campbell said the paradigm is going to be competition, but Blinken at certain points had said we'll cooperate where we can, and there'll be extreme cooperation in other areas depending on the circumstances. But from a geopolitical and versus what sort of nationalistic forces are at play here, is it still possible to cooperate on some of these key areas like climate change in particular? And then for Troy, just a bit separately, you talked about the supply chain review, and as part of the supply chain review, the Biden administration was talking about working with allies and partners on shoring up its own supply chains. But another approach that they're taking on economic policy as part of Biden's Build Back Better agenda, the key part of his international economic policy so far has been this Buy American agenda, this Buy American policy. And yesterday, they instituted several new new measures to help shore up that policy, where the American government would sort of use its leverage to help buy American-made goods and businesses to help shore up American companies. So how do you sort of, are those two, I guess they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but how do you see them playing out with allies moving forward as the United States tries to shore up supply chain abroad? So I guess I'll turn to Jacques and Danielle first, if you have any questions, thoughts, or comments about my questions or something that someone else had said during the session so far.
Which one of us do you want to go first?
Jacques, yeah, I think by speaking first, you volunteered.
All right. I'm pessimistic. I think one of the consequences of the relationship taking on such ideological tones, sort of conflict of different systems and wolf warrior on the China side and the values emphasis in Biden foreign policy, which, in many ways one might welcome, but it does sort of take that temperature up. And again, I don't think this is new. It wasn't new with Trump entirely. The seeds were there beforehand. I mean, you look at Obama's description of TPP, and it was something we had to do to decide whether the U.S. or China was going to set the rules of the world economy for the next century. I mean, this is not out of nowhere, so it's not going to go away. The one area, as you know, that often gets pointed to as an area of cooperation is climate change. That one doesn't have obvious ideological resonance, and indeed that one has taken a step or two down. It wasn't that long ago that China was very much of the common but differentiated responsibilities approach, which said the West polluted, why should we in the developing world have to cut our own emissions? I think it's become an existential enough crisis that kind of friction is probably gone. On the other hand, cooperating to solve this, as we can see, Paris is unambitious and it's not being achieved. So that's kind of pessimistic. The one area I'm actually weirdly optimistic a little bit is on the economic side. We are saying all sorts of things. We're taking all sorts of steps that are toward decoupling, but we are moving from a base of extremely deep integration, the complete abandonment of which would be very costly to both sides. So for all the heat and noise, a lot of stuff is still going on, and I think some of those issues, although some of them are very volatile, they're manageable without turning into a sort of headlong, full-fledged decoupling.
And I guess let me just add, I think generally speaking, I agree with Jacques' analysis. I think what I would add is that I think the United States is very pragmatic. I think that the ideological differences manifest in a lack of trust, but that the United States, certainly isn't about to let concerns about human rights or democracy stand in the way of concrete cooperation on areas of shared concern like the climate, if that is possible. And so, I think we are seeing right now a real kind of what I hope is the bottom of relations. I hope it doesn't get worse. This week the talks in Tianjin didn't go so well. But these things ebb and flow. And I don't think the fact that the relationship is difficult now means that, cooperation in the future is impossible.
So I think, Kyle, there's an inherent contradiction built into the Biden administration policy, which they're going to have to try and resolve, which is that, one, they want to restore U.S. manufacturing capacity. This has more to do about jobs in the U.S. than it does with supply chain security. If you take and you move all of our supply chains to the U.S., you just create risk here rather than spreading it around global supply chains. We saw this in the case of Texas with the storm earlier this year, to where the Samsung factory, which produces 5% of the world's semiconductors, was shut down for 5 weeks. If you bring everything here, you have similar natural disaster type issues. You lose access to everything that you need. So at the same time, though, if you want to build relationships with allies, economics and security are merging now in a way that we haven't seen, be it either through semiconductor production, 5G deployment, how things are going to work online in terms of e-commerce and artificial intelligence. And so I think at some point they're going to have to try and sort of square this, peg and everything to figure out how you take and bring some production back to the United States, but work with allies. And this is where I really want to see more on the trade side, because we really need to have deeper conversation with our allies about how we have secure supply chains between ourselves. We've seen this on sort of a bilateral level with Korea and Japan, but it needs to be broader.
Well, thank you, Troy, and thank you, Danielle and Jacques, for your very great answers. We're very short on time, but Gil, you have certainly earned the right to ask any final questions or add any final comments before we wrap up.
Well, I'm just delighted with these presentations and with the overall results of this effort. I would just say that if we think more deeply about national identity gaps, what can the Biden administration do so to deal with 4 of these gaps? First one, the Japan-South Korea gap. Can it narrow it? Then there's the South Korea-China gap. Can it widen it so that it's already wide, but can it capitalize on the democracy thinking in South Korea? And the third is the India-China gap. Can US efforts to persuade India to be more part of the international democratic community be successful? But one final gap that I pay particular attention to is the Sino-Russian gap. It's been pretty narrow, but there's some signs that it might be a little bit fragile. That things are beginning to change a little bit. And so will Biden have any way of influencing this, or will it keep widening both the Russia and China gaps with the United States and China and Russia working together? So I'll just close with that. I think there's so many questions that are raised by our discussions that I really look forward to continuing this process with Kyle in the coming year.
Well, there are still more questions and hopefully some more answers in the Joint US-Korea book. If you haven't had a chance to read it just yet, like I said, it's up on our website, keia.org, under the Analysis and Publications tab. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.